Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. If you love this watch, email me, tmosso@thewatchbox.com. It's in the description below. Your purchase and pricing email question line for buying this or any watch you see on any Watchbox platform. Please reach out to me directly. Email me at tmosso@thewatchbox.com. New for 2021, we have the second generation of a watch that launched back at Baselworld 2014. This is the Omega Seamaster 300, Generation 2 in stainless steel. It's 41 millimeters in diameter, 14 millimeters thick, from lug tip to lug tip across its vintage profiled case, 48.1 millimeters. If we add the end link, we get a little bit of extension. Now it's 50.1 millimeters total distance across the wrist, with modern 21 millimeter spacing between the lugs. Now, of course, the original version of this was a timepiece that recalled the original Seamasters of the late 1950s, the original Seamaster 300s. Now, this timepiece that you see right here is the second generation, and there have been a couple of modifications. We may as well talk about those before we do the wrist shot. First of all, we have a much more heavily cambered sapphire that's designed to look more like a bubble plexi, so true to history. A bit of an unusual swap in modern watchmaking. The ceramic bezel insert from the first generation model here gives way to a more vintage evocative anodized aluminum unit. You can see the dial has changed. One element brought over from the 2015 Seamaster 300 Spectre is the use of the Lollipop seconds hand, which is a true vintage Seamaster Q. You can also see that the Arabic numerals, the quarter Arabics of the dial, have changed from the previous font to a sort of open 6, open 9 vintage font that's true to history, but also take note that it's now a sandwich dial like Panerai with recessed blocks of lume beneath the plane of a stencil dial. It's a blue matte dial on top. You'll also note that a lot of the extraneous printing on the first generation of this watch is gone. Nothing about it being a master coaxial or master chronometer. None of that's on the dial side. As with the latest revision of the Moon watch, all of the advertising, the modern advertising and tech notes are on the back. Now the timepiece, we'll throw it on my wrist, which is 16 centimeters in circumference. We'll get a look at it. The bezel, in addition to being aluminum, is a little bit thinner and flatter than the previous version of the watch. Now my wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference, and you can see it sits well. The watch is said to be thinner, and true to the claim, I measured this watch 14 millimeters thick versus the previous model's 15, so there has been a change for the best in that direction. I could recommend this watch for a wrist as small as 14 centimeters circumference, because especially if you put it on a strap, it's just not that broad across the wrist. It's not particularly thin, though it's thinner. You can see it's relatively sheer in profile with a little bit of a cantilevered bezel, so it's not going to fit underneath the toughest of dress cuffs, though a jacket should be just fine. Taking a look at the bracelet, we have a 3-link design that's alternately satin finished and polished, sort of the inverse of an oyster bracelet, which would be satinated on the flanks and polished down the center. This is satinated down the center and polished on the flanks. Removable links are fixed by screws. You can see we have a half link in there, and we have a push button slider, so you have the ability to make small incremental adjustments over about 9.6 millimeters of incremental range. Taking a quick look at the clasp, you can see it's very thick gauge steel, alternately satinated and polished, single fold. It has a twin trigger release. You pop it open, and thanks to the twin trigger, it's never going to pop open unless you press both triggers. That's the advantage of such a system. The case is very similar to the previous watch in that it has the classical thin shoulders of a vintage watch. A lot of vintage watches and watches inspired by vintage watches have very narrow case bands, and that's true here. We have satin polish along the side, and then we have high polish along the tops. You can see that there's a little bit of a transitional bevel and then a squared off end profile that's very consistent with history, as is the lack of crown guards. We have a inverse conical crown with a sharp knurling that is a screw down. The watch is 300 meters water resistant. Let's turn the bezel and have a listen. One of the best I've felt, and a big improvement on previous Omega bezels. It is 120 click, very precise. It's got a nice sharp detent, but it never feels gritty or crude. You can see that it has a coloration with the dark navy blue and then the ecru off-white that matches the dial. So at the very least, the photina on the bezel matches the photina on the dial. We may as well do a lume shot. And as you can see, the entirety of the bezel is now wonderfully loomed. We have a green pearl that you can line up with the green minute hand, and because those two are green and everything else is blue, it's easy to tell them apart. The watch looks rather like a Blancpain 50 Fathoms in the dark, and you can see that lollipop seconds hand coasting along. The timepiece features a new movement. It is now a master chronometer, METAS certified. This is caliber 8912, previously the 8400. It has some of the 8400's features, such as I'll demonstrate all of them, the hacking seconds function, but also the mobile hour hand time zone jumpers function. Note the minute hand and the seconds hand are not affected. I can travel more easily using that feature. Now flipping it all over, you can see this 38 joule movement, and it is a no-date movement. That's why it's not the standard 39. Has two mainspring barrels with a 60-hour automatic winding power reserve. The two barrels also allow less balance amplitude drop after, for example, 24 or 48 hours. Single barrel movements have a bigger issue there. It's braced against shock with a full balance bridge and a free sprung index, and against magnetism thanks to a number of features led by the silicon hairspring. It is a coaxial escapement as envisioned by George Daniels and industrialized in 1999 by Omega. It allows this watch to keep excellent time, have minimal maintenance needs, and allows Omega to bestow a 5-year warranty on these timepieces. And of course, it is a master chronometer, or METAS certified, which means it's everything the COSC is, but tested as a fully cased up watch, and also tested for water resistance, shock resistance, winding efficiency, power reserve, and anti-magnetism. It is a complete test of the finished watch. Reach out to Team Mosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing details.